have the wet test, 2 tests, TTLC, STLC. It basically looks at, checks for 19 inorganics and 18 organics. That is the California wet test. That's on that following page. And there's roughly 20, 30, 37 chemicals that are included in that screen. The federal government has determined the toxicity for 40 chemicals. The state of California has determined the toxicity of our 1.8 to 2.5 million chemicals. They have a list now, 37 chemicals. There it is. It's in your book. That's it. But I don't have those chemicals. I have other chemicals. Oh, okay. Well, then what the state says is, if any of those 37 chemicals are present above the TTLC, game over, it's a non-recreational hazardous waste. If any of those chemicals are above the STLC in the state of California, all right, it's a hazardous waste. It's a non-recreational hazardous waste. If doesn't have any of those chemicals, or they're below those thresholds, then the state says, well, I got an idea. Go ahead and check for oral LD50, dermal LD50, inhalation LC50. So you can send it to a NIOSH-approved lab. It's roughly $60,000 to $80,000, 9 months, and they can determine the toxicity at that lab to tell you definitively yes or no. They can do it. It can be done. Has never been done, but it can be done. So why is it in the criteria? Where would that be a benefit to me? How would that help me? When would I use it? Yeah. I buy a product that's regulated by TSCA, and they were forced to do testing to determine the resultant concentration or toxicity of that liquid, or the solid, or the powder, or the poison. And they did testing, not on the individual chemical components, but the overall product itself. And on my product, whether it's paint, epoxy, resin, cleaner, degreasing compound, I know the oral LD50, dermal, or LC50 inhalation. It's on my MSDS. I buy it, don't use it, and I'm going to get rid of it. So that MSDS, that LD50, LC50 values, they're representative of the waste. That is the waste. I can use it. Other than that, we're a deck out of water. It won't apply. I won't use it. But I can use it for that. Okay, but be careful. I want to use the resultant for the mixture that I bought. It's a mixture. It's a per of chemicals. You'll find LD and LC50 values for components. It's the overall resultant waste combination itself. And it can be determined statistically in the formula in Title 22 that allows you for determining it statistically was used about 6-7 years ago, and the formula actually was inversely proportional to the correct formula, and was the first time it was ever used in 20 some odd years, and they corrected the formula, and then it probably hasn't been used since. So you know what I just said but I didn't say? Do you know what I just actually told you but I didn't actually tell you? There's a formula for determining toxicity using a statistical analysis in Title 22 using LD50s for different chemical components of a waste stream. Nobody's ever done it. I've wasted 10 minutes of your time explaining it to you. Okay. But it's in there. It's never been done. And the one time it was done, they found out that the formula posted in Title 22 was wrong. Okay? Okay, so let's go to acute aquatic 96-hour bioassay. And this is the one we talk about. This is where you take a representative sample, and if you take a representative sample of 500 milligrams per liter and put it into a representative tank that has 3 relative sensitive species of fish, stickleback, fat minnow, rainbow trout, and then you take a control tank. Maybe the fish die because it gets cold in this room. Okay, well, let's do a control tank. And you know what? If the regulatory threshold is 500 milligrams per liter, let's do a tank that's 1.5 times that. Let's do a tank that's half that. Just see how close we are if some of the fish start to die. It's called a definitive test. And then what we'll do is we're going to put 40 fish into 4 different tanks, and we're going to wait 96 hours. And if 5 or more of the fish expire in 96 hours, 4 days, then that is a determinant that if it's the tank with 500 milligrams per liter, if it's the median tank, that makes that waste a hazardous waste. That sample that you put in that tank is representative of a hazardous waste in the state of California. That's a non-recreational hazardous waste. Okay. That was adopted from your NPDES permit conditions under the Clean Water Act, where a POTW that has tertiary treatment that discharges into a basin of water tests the water before they discharge it. How do they do that? They put 10 species of fish, fathead minnow, stickleback, rainbow trout, in a fish tank. They wait 96 hours, and they see whether or not it kills the fish. State said, great idea. There's a lot of stuff that kills fish. They started figuring that out, like salt, table salt, sodium chloride. So there are 23 regularly handled, sold, purchased consumer products that are excluded from being a hazardous waste in California. And I put them in the book. They're in there. We can read them. But salt's one of them because it kills the fish. But that is the catch basin. It trickles through or it drips through, and it's not captured RCRA. It doesn't get captured under the non-RCRA criteria, and it gets down to this, you ready? This last catch basin, and all of a sudden that fishing net has very tight web. That's what captures it. That's where a lot of wastes that are otherwise not subject to being a hazardous waste ends up being captured. Questions? We good? We good? So I'm not going to get the question, what happens to the fish that die? Are they hazardous waste? Or we're good? Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Right. Right. So if it's on the California list of either common names or chemical constituent, and it's listed because, and you know it's listed because in parentheses after the common name it says why it's listed. Is it corrosive, ignitable, toxic, reactive? What the state says is you subject these media of tests to that waste, and if it doesn't fail any of them, then it's not a hazardous waste. Not federal, not state. And we're talking state right now. If it fails any of those, then it's captured by whether it's a federal or a state criteria. It's captured. It's a hazardous waste. When it's listed for being corrosive and toxic, you don't have to check corrosive and toxic. You have to check them all. You have to be certain that it's not corrosive, toxic, as well as reactive and ignitable. But if it doesn't fail any of them, then that presumptive waste that's on that list, it's not a hazardous waste. Now, the NIOSH process for determining oral and dermal and inhalation LD and LC50s, very expensive. Nobody does it. Nobody does it. They use the fish bioassay. You can do a fish bioassay screen for about $200. You can do a definitive test for about $300 to $600, $800, depending on where you send it to. It's very definitive. When the test is done, it's yes or no. I'm going to go back to the question that was asked earlier. Yes or no? I want an answer. Yes or no? I can give you a definitive yes or no. If I've got 5 fish upside down, dead as a board, it's a hazardous waste. If I've got 6 fish that are swimming around and the 6th one is upside down, but his gills are moving, after 96 hours, not a hazardous waste. We're getting really close. Not a hazardous waste. Very definitive. Yeah. Question? Okay. Yeah, you'll have that. You know what you're... Okay, what I said, but I didn't say, yeah, you will skip it. Because when you get an MSDS, it'll give you all the oral, dermal, inhalation, LC50 values for all the components for each of those that make up that material, but you probably won't have an overall LD or LC value, dermal absorption or inhalation, for that product. You'll have it for all the chemicals. You won't have it for the product. What you need it for is the product. And you can go to DTSC. You can actually plug in all those values. Anybody in here have a math degree? Mathematics, calculus, integral calculus. Okay, I'm wasting everybody's time. Find somebody with an integral calculus degree, and they can take those values and they can plug it into a formula that looks like Greek to most of us, and they can determine definitively yay or nay. Yeah. Let's say it's yay. Okay, that's hazardous waste. If it's nay, and nobody does oral LD, dermal absorption, or LC50 inhalation. Nobody does it. You can. It's there. Nobody does it. You could. You should. Nobody does it. Wow. It's like the whole T-clip. You know, they use the attenuation of 5% is going to be extracted from the soil. It really depends on the substrate. I mean, the soil, the conditions, the alkalinity, the acidity of the soil, the condition of the soil, the moisture content. So many things influence that. They just took a swag out of the air. Yeah. They're smart. I don't know. They never use rainbow trout. Probably going to use stickleback. Stickleback seem to be the hardiest, then fat minnow, rainbow trout. You look at them cross-eyed, they typically die. Yeah. Question? Okay. It's real. After 96 hours, within that second of when we started the test, how many fish do I have that are alive? Alive. If I got 6 fish or more alive, we're good to go. If I got 5 dead, 5 alive, it's game over. It's hazardous waste. Oh, 1 dead? We're good to go. Yeah. And then what I'm going to do, I have 1 dead in the 500 milligram tanks. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I'm going to go to the 750 milligram tank. I'm going to look at it. Okay, they're all dead. Well, still not a hazardous waste? We better be really certain that the sample was representative. You know why? Because if that wasn't representative, and at my 750 milligram tank, which is 1.5 times the concentration for determining whether it's hazardous or not hazardous, they're all dead. So a little bit above that representative sample, they all died. Yeah. Yeah.
So by representative, is that you're just doing that 1 time? Or are you doing that 4 times? Like the other one?
Okay. Am I going to bring enforcement against the generator using the 80% confidence? No, let's leave PETA out of this. My wife is a huge dog lover, so I always use the example of dogs. And so, but if we talk about determining, if you are challenged in court, where the rubber hits the road is 80% confidence. You cannot establish 80% confidence without 4 samples. Now, if you do 4 samples, you still might not be able to establish 80% confidence. Because if you look at the regulatory threshold, and the values that I'm getting are just right below this, right below it, I may have an excursion above it and still not be hazardous waste. Below it, above it, below it. I may have to take 10, 12, 14, 16. Statistically, I can determine it. We can figure out. You need 27 samples. And after 27, then I can tell you definitively. But to establish whether or not it's hazardous or non-hazardous, 80% confidence. And to get to an 80% confidence requires 4 samples. Oh, by the way, How many times are you required to sample your waste, by the way? Just out of curiosity. Remember? None. Okay, so if I'm challenged, then what's going to happen? An enforcement agency may be prudent and knowledgeable, knowing that it takes an 80% confidence, so they may visit me 2 or 3 or 4 times. Okay, number one. Number two, after they visit me one time and I get an aliquot and I sample it, it turns out that it's above the regulatory threshold, they may come back a second time. They can bring enforcement without doing it 4 times, number one. Number two, if I think, no, that's not the case, I want to establish it's not, but I'm kind of bordering on being hazardous, not being hazardous, almost hazardous, but I have to be able to have an 80% confidence, and that is what is the recommended methodology that's in the appendices to Title 22 for establishing and determining hazardous waste statistics. If the sample is representative, I have confidence in it. If the sample is not representative because the process changes, that's where I may have some extended liabilities, because then I'd have to look at that waste that's produced from that process uniquely because it's not representative of what I sampled before. We good? We're good? Good? Okay. All right. LC, we talked about this. Here is your predominant differences between the federal T-clip and the state wet test. Federally, T-clip, it's diluted 20 to 1. State's diluted 10 to 1. It's digested for less than about 24 hours. 18 is SWB 846. California digests your materials in solids, like soil, for 2 days. Okay? Very similar. The state STLC determination of whether or not a waste is hazardous, very similar to the federal T-clip. There's some differences. This is what they are. Okay, this is the fish bioassay. We talked about that. We're good to go? Good? Okay. Federally. Okay. That is what makes a waste a characteristic waste. I've covered all the federal characteristics. I've covered all the state characteristics. We're good to go? Ignitable, corrosive, reactive, toxic. Ignitable is exactly the same as reactive, state and federal. Toxic, very different. Kill fish in California, you look at it, 1 in 30, 40 chemicals federally. 37 chemicals in California. Hey, those chemicals are not present at that threshold. See if you can kill the fish. Fish doesn't die. Okay? Not a hazardous waste according to that. So now what I'm going to do is talk about listed wastes. Wastes that are listed. Okay? There is a specific rule established federally under RCRA that came out 10 years ago. Almost 10 years ago. I'm going to skip it. I'm going to skip this. Because in California, it's not going to apply to you. Because if it does, you have a tiered permit under tiered permitting. So we don't do it. Okay, the mixture rule, federally. If you do this in California, you have a permit under tiered permitting. But federally, I can take a waste that's a hazardous waste that exhibits a characteristic of a hazardous waste. It's corrosive, pH of 1. I can mix it with enough water, pH now is 5. I can discharge it to a POTW that can accept it under the Clean Water Act. We're okay. I can do that. Can't do it in California. That's treatment. But the mixture rule says if you have a hazardous waste that exhibits a characteristic mixed with a solid waste, which can include water, and it no longer exhibits a characteristic, it's not subject to hazardous waste regulations federally. It doesn't apply to us. We're in California. Can't do that. That's treatment. That's dilution. So I can go through the rest of the mixture rule, but those elements don't apply to us, so I'm going to skip it. Question? Is there a question? Question. Clarifier. Clarifier. Okay. An oil water separator. Okay.
You're mixing, say, I don't know, pollutants that are on the ground that wasn't the clarifier drain.
Yep. I got pollutants on the ground that go into the clarifier. Washing trailers and trucks go into the sump, okay?
trailer or truck maintenance.
Truck maintenance, okay?
Going in there.
Right.
So you've got a lot of water going in there.
Yep.
But you've got some things that are hazardous.
Yep. Yep. Hazardous components or, yep.
So is that hazardous?
This is what hazardous.
Is that treatment actually?
No, it's a process. No, it's a process. Yeah. I may even add surfactants to the water. Yeah. Yeah. Now, in an oil water separator, if what goes into the oil water separator exhibits a hazardous waste characteristic, and then it actually removes the sediment, or it goes through a filtration process to return aqueous media to be reused in the clarifier, it may very easily be considered treatment if what is treated in the clarifier exhibits a hazardous waste. But it's excluded from getting a tiered permit because it's on-site recycling, because you're reclaiming and reusing the material on site. So yeah, it's treatment. But you're not subject to tiered permitting, but it is treatment. Yep. 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 Yeah, it's excluded under 25143.2 A or C. It's an exclusion. Yeah. But it's treatment. Yeah. But that's good, because you're reclaiming and reusing. Okay. All right. So mixture rules. I'm going to skip this. Other questions? Was there another question in the back? There's a question right here.
Yeah, I would back the truck, come and clean that out.
The clarifier.
Clean the clarifier
Okay.
out. And when I do the hazardous waste profiles or tests on it, it comes back negative on all the metals.
On the metal, okay.
But
Okay, when you have that, is it a sludge, liquid, or is it a solid where they do the metals?
liquid.
So liquid. Okay. So you have them do a CAM 17. Okay, when you do a CAM 17 on the liquid, you get back a result that's in milligrams per liter. And whatever that result is that I get back, that's the total. That's the soluble, that's the T-clip, that's the LCL. They're all the same. So look across the board. Look at them all. Okay. And what happens?
Well, and so then it goes to one of the local processors, water treatment, and they recycle it, and I get a certificate back. So that's non-hazardous, and so it's not a non-RECRA, it's a non-haz waste, right?
Without being too pedantic, which I've already done, it probably would easily qualify for either an industrial waste or a designated waste. But it's probably not a RECRA, and it's probably not a non-RECRA. Right. Yeah. The only thing that I could capture it by at that point is fish bioassay. Try to kill fish. Yeah. And that's normally not done. Yeah. We're good? Any other questions? There was another question. Somebody had a question. Question? Good. All right. I'm going to skip that. Okay. 3 classes are read. Skip that. Okay. California codes. The California waste codes are found, used to be on the manifest. Now they're in Title 22. And there's a series of number of codes. The restricted codes are the 700 and 800 codes. If you apply a California code to a hazardous waste, the non-RECRA code to California waste, just be consistent. When you apply a RECRA code to a RECRA waste, not only are you going to want to be consistent, but that code's going to drive the treatment standard. If you apply a characteristic code to a California waste, and it's a RECRA characteristic, and you apply a RECRA characteristic code to a hazardous waste in California, you also have to identify all of the underlying chemical constituents on the land disposal form, which is 216 chemicals. So the second I give it a D code, a federal RECRA D code to my waste, there is an entire list of chemicals that I'm now required as the generator to identify whether or not they're present once it's a characteristic waste. Not a listed waste, not what I'm getting ready to go through, it's characteristic waste. Okay. Federally, the characteristic waste code, or the waste code, drives the treatment standard. How you treat it. What is the treatment standard? How is it to be treated? At what level can I encapsulate it or solidify it? When can I land dispose it? It's all driven by the federal code. California, I gave a class on waste classification at UC Davis in 1985. And there was a gentleman from DHS before DTSC that was in the audience, and him and two of his colleagues asked if I wanted to be enlightened to where the codes came from. I said, sure. Back manifest. That's where they come from. No. In 1983, they gathered all these manifests at DHS, and they went through them looking at the various waste streams that are produced in California, and they came up with the California waste codes that to this day exist on the back, no longer the back, actually on Title 22. That's where they came from. They were eating pizzas, drinking a beer, going through 5,000 some odd manifests. That's where they came from. And if you ever look at the codes, it makes sense. They're real general. Just be consistent. If it's a halogenated solvent, then it's a halogenated solvent. Use that code. But if you don't have a halogenated solvent and it's not specified, but it's not halogenated, use the other code. If it's an oxygenated solvent, use that code. But be consistent. With your waste stream, be consistent. Because those codes that you apply to that can easily be tracked, DTSC and the CUPAs, for determining what frequencies of disposal or disposition of the waste. And if all of a sudden it doesn't appear on any manifest for some frequency of time, and we come back to your generator site, did they classify it right? Plus the load could get rejected. And that's because of more of the LDR, land disposal restrictions. It doesn't fit the profile. It doesn't match. But those are your codes. No pecking order, with one exception. If you can apply a 700 or an 800 code to your waste on the manifest out of Title 22, you have to use the code. None of the 700, and there's one 800 number for dioxin, that code doesn't apply. Well, then use any code. As long as it's consistent and it makes sense, use that code. That's the code. Okay, exclusions for specific substances. Did I blow through listed waste? Did we talk about listed waste? There you are. There it is. In your book, there's 4 categories federally of listed waste. There's 1 category in California. If it's mercury and it's in a substance and it's in a waste that you produce at your facility, it's an M listed. Whether it comes from an automotive light, ballast, bulb, mercury, high-density discharge lamp. If it contains mercury, it's M listed, it's a listed waste, it's a hazardous waste in California. No more shell game. Is it above the STLC or the TTLC? It doesn't matter. Game over. California, the waste contains mercury, it's an M listed waste, it's hazardous waste, it's a non-mercury hazardous waste. Turns out that it's a universal waste. It's universal waste. That is, then I go to my ST or TTLC, because if it's water containing mercury, it doesn't fall under the M listed category. So that would still be a hazardous waste if it's above the T-clip or the STLC. 1 part per million would be mercury, would probably be below it, so probably would not be. Yeah, might be a designated waste. We still may not be able to take it to a landfill, because first of all, a landfill can't accept and dispose of liquids anyway. So it has to be solidified, but we're not dealing with a hazardous waste. Yeah. Yep. Okay, 4 categories: F codes, K codes, P codes, and U codes. For hazardous waste, the F codes come from what's referred to as nonspecific sources, where the chemical that is used in a process is listed. However, the process is unspecific. And in your book, if you look at the F codes, it identifies chemical components, chemicals, chlorobenzene, trichloroethylene, used in a cleaning operation, degreasing operation. If I use it and becomes spent, it's a solvent. I have to process it, recycle it, reclaim it before I can further use it. That's spent. The F codes and the K codes are used, and they're spent, and they come from processes. The F codes do not identify the specific process necessarily, although we do have one for degreasing, but it lists the actual chemicals that are used in the process. I don't care how you use them, but if you use these chemicals and they become used for the properties of being a solvent, spent. F listed. If that solvent prior to use is present in concentration 10% or greater. Okay? Not as an ingredient, like in a product. I got paint. Paint has 3% acetone, and it has 4% MEK in my paint. Some of the VOCs that are used. I paint it on and it evaporates. Okay? I'm going to get rid of the paint and didn't use it. I did use the paint. I kind of got contaminated the paint. I did use the paint. I didn't put it on the wall, but I put my brush in it, and I'm going to get rid of my paint. Well, that paint, it's not a spent solvent. It's got solvents in it, yep. It's been used, yep, but it's not spent. It was part of the ingredient of a product. But if I go down to Kragen or Lowe's or Costco and buy a can of MEK, and then I take it to my facility to clean painting equipment, and I collect the solvent, and I put it in a liquid container, and I spill some, and I wipe it up with a rag, and I put that in another container, so I got two different waste streams that potentially creates problems. Then what I'm going to do when I go to dispose of that material, it's a candidate for an F-listed solvent. It's spent. I don't care how you used it, spent, F. K codes, industry specific. You can look them in the book. So do you work in the refining industry, pharmaceutical, veterinarian? What do we do? Well, I paint houses. I work in the painting industry. Well, look in the K codes, and does it have anything in there for the painting industry? No, it's got organic chemicals, inorganic, wood preservation. Do you preserve wood using pentachlorophenol? Pesticides, no, paint houses. Inorganic chemicals. Wastewater treatment sludge from mercury cell process of chlorine production. No, I paint houses. Coking, it's a refinery. Primary aluminum, secondary lead, iron, steel, petroleum refinery, ink formation. Don't make ink. I paint houses. These are very specific codes that are specific to a process, not the chemical used in the process. Those are the K codes. Okay? So the F codes are non-specific source. I don't know what they come from, but I know exactly the chemical used. The K codes come from an unspecified use of whatever chemicals, but the source is very specific. Those are specific source codes. In other words, it identifies specific industries. I don't care what chemical you use. And whatever you produce, it's a hazardous waste. It's listed. It's a federally listed RCRA hazardous waste. Don't care what you use. F codes, I do care what chemicals you use, but I don't care what process you use it in. Footnote. When did we develop RCRA? How long have we had RCRA? How long has RCRA been around? Yeah, you know how old this is? I can do this. I graduated high school in 76, 36 years? Is that right? Is that 36? Yeah. You know how many industries have changed, come or gone since this? Now, we added the coking, the K codes, here about, it was about 8, 10 years ago, 12 years ago. This is a very archaic list. It's been proposed to be updated for a number of times federally under RCRA. Hasn't happened yet. Probably may not happen in our lifetime, but it might. But there's proposed changes to the codes. But if it's been used, it's an F or K. I didn't use it. I bought it. I'm going to use it. I didn't use it. Not only do you get up and leave, you forget your jacket, and then you have to come back and then grab the jacket in front of the classroom. Oh, no, it's okay. It was nice talking to you. Okay, the P and the U. The P codes are for chemicals that I buy that I'm going to use, and I haven't used them. They're not used. Now I'm going to get rid of them. Oh, okay. And the sole active constituent in that ingredient is listed. Okay, then the P code or the U code applies. If there's more than one sole active constituent, then the code doesn't apply. Well, there's actually one active constituent, and then there's a preservative and a carrier solvent. So the preservative preserves the carrier solvent, helps deliver it, but there's only one active constituent, like a lot of pesticides. Oh, okay. What is it? Is it listed? Is it on the list? And if it is on the list, then it's regulated. I bought it, I didn't use it, I stored it, and all of a sudden I'm going to get rid of it. Those codes apply, P or U. It's unspent. Unspent formulations. If I used it, if I applied it, it's spent. Codes don't apply. So a lot of the profiles ask for the process producing the waste. I spilled it. Well, that's the process that produced the waste. Okay. Well, spill residues thereof are also P and U listed. Spill residue. If I spill it, didn't use it, I was going to use it, I spilled it. I clean up the dirt, the soil, then if that chemical is present at any detectable amount, hazardous waste. Yeah. It's listed. Any detectable amount. And then we can play the shell game, right? Well, set the detection level at 10%. Don't see anything. Set it at 1 part per billion. Got a lot in there. So if it's detected, and I have indosulfan, or paraquat, or DDT, or 2,4,5-triphenoxyphenic acid, 2,4,5-T, and I test the soil, and it's present, then it's listed because that waste that I never used and I spilled is detectable in the soil, and once contaminated with a listed waste, it's always a listed waste. And that waste is a P or a U waste. The difference is a P waste are very toxic, a U waste are sort of toxic. They're toxic. They're just not as toxic as a P waste. Okay, we good? We good? Any questions? We are so close to being done. We've rounded the last turn. Okay. Yeah. Paints. Now, paint would never be a P or U because a P or U applies to a sole active chemical constituent. The active ingredient in paint includes 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 different chemicals. So it'd never be a P, never be a U. It's not a K, it's not an F. It's not going to be a listed waste federally. And unless it has mercury, and if it does, even it's still not a listed waste. It's not equipment. So it would be regulated as a hazardous waste because it exhibits a characteristic. It's ignitable, flashpoint. It's not going to be corrosive. There are some paints that are corrosive, however. It's not reactive. Could be, not the case. Probably toxic. Kills fish. And really, the paint may not be toxic. They may put a fungicide in the paint that kills the fish in the fish bioassay. It's the fungicide in the paint that's a preservative that kills the fish that causes the paint to be hazardous waste. Unless I claim the regulatory exclusion for latex paint. I'm going to cover that here in about 10 minutes. Yeah, cadmium, chromium, if they're above the regulatory threshold that is captured. Not hazardous, talked about that. Skip, talked about that. True residues, skip, talked about waste codes. Exclusions. Well, there are certain chemicals, salt, if you put them in the water, it kills the fish. Salt is a hazardous waste. Or actually, salt would be considered a hazardous waste. We excluded it. And there's a list in your book towards the back of your handout that lists those common commercial products used in industry that would make a waste toxic to fish that are excluded because they're consumer goods. And they're on page They're on page, there's no page numbers. They're 3-4 pages from the end of the book. And they include, ready? Check this out. Vinegar, aluminum chloride, ammonium bromide, boric acid, calcium fluoride, calcium formate, calcium propionate, sodium bicarbonate, which is baking soda, used in mouthwashes, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, salt. There you go. So these are chemicals that if this is what makes the fish die in a fish bioassay, and it comes from a consumer product, and I use it for my house or my business, not hazardous waste. Excluded. Exception to the rule. By the way, after going through the regulations with you, which probably helped some of you, might not have helped some of you, there's probably as many or more regulatory exclusions that I'm going to cover in the last 5 minutes than regulations that cover what's covered. Okay? Some of those are in the regulations. Some of those exclusions or exemptions are in the health and safety code. Okay. All right, so there's that. We're good to go? Any questions on this? Yep. Special waste. A special waste is a waste that is a hazardous waste that is excluded federally under RCRA that can go to a landfill and be buried because it was lobbied successfully in D.C. where it should not be subject to hazardous waste management requirements. California said, no, we'll regulate it. Although, you know what we'll do? We'll regulate it as a special waste. So that's a hazardous waste that will allow you to have certain exceptions to the rules, like you don't have to use a manifest. It doesn't have to go to a Class 1 landfill, although most of them still do. And special waste is you don't have to use a registered hauler. A little more flexibility. And potentially it may be cheaper to dispose of. And depending on how much I generate, it may be worthwhile if I generate large volumes. A special waste is a hazardous waste, number one. So it has to be a hazardous waste under California. It's a California non-RCRA hazardous waste. It may not contain no persistent or bioaccumulative substance. And that's not in your handout, but it's in Title 22. And if it contains a substance which is bioaccumulative above a certain regulatory threshold, all bets are off. That's not a special waste. Special wastes are typically, they involve inorganics. It's metals. Typically it's metals. Number one. Number two, the TTLC for solubilized and extractable concentrations. A special waste is a hazardous waste because either, you ready? The STLC value for the metal is above the STLC regulatory threshold, or the TTLC value for the metal is above the TTLC regulatory threshold. That's what makes it a hazardous waste. A great example, and there's a list here, fly ash, bag house. A lot of recovery systems for vapor will produce fine solids that have metals accumulated in them that are above either the STLC or the TTLC, so it fails the wet test. No, that's a hazardous waste. Well, bag house is a perfect example. A bag house is a perfect candidate for being a special waste because it fails one or the other, but the solubilized concentration of the metal is going to be below the TTLC value threshold. The solubilized STLC value has to be below the TTLC value. So if the solubilized metal is so far above where it's above the TTLC value, all bets are off. Not a special waste, not a candidate. And most special wastes, they're significantly below the threshold. So if it contains barium, and barium makes it a hazardous waste in California because the barium is above the STLC value. And the STLC value for barium is what? 100. And the TTLC value for barium is 10,000. So if I run a soluble ice test for STLC, for this to be a special waste, if I run my STLC, the barium value has to be below 10,000. It's above 100 because that makes it hazardous waste. And then I have to petition to Cal, EPA, DTSC, and I need DTSC to actually concur with me and to agree with me that it's not a hazardous waste. And then that special waste, once there's concurrence, is managed as a special waste on my behalf. Very specific to an industry, type of waste, and to a location. I don't petition. My friend generates the same waste that I've got. Doesn't work, doesn't apply. I still have to apply separately and independently for it to be a special waste in California. The disposal options are greater for special wastes. And I don't have to use a manifest. If I don't manifest it, it doesn't count against my generator status. So if it goes out on a bill of lading, like universal waste, it doesn't count against my generator status. So if I actually have something go out on a manifest, like used oil that's being recycled, and it's on a manifest, it counts against my generator status. In this instance, it doesn't, because it's not on a manifest. And then regulatory exclusions. You name it. Paint. There's a regulatory exclusion for paint that is collected at HHW programs, and the paint is then reused. There's a regulatory exclusion for lead-acid batteries. I talked about it earlier. There's a regulatory exclusion for shop towels. And that's the question where I was going with earlier with contaminated towels. Fuel filters. Fuel filters. And we modified this here about, 3-4 years ago. You can put your fuel filters in with your oil filters. You couldn't for years. Of course, the industry did it forever, and they still do. So we finally said, all right, you can put them both together. It may change the proper shipping description because the hazards may be different. But fuel filters, diesel filters, gasoline filters, oil filters, you can actually put them together. But what do you do before you put them together comes under this exclusion. Fuel filters, oil filters, drained oil filters, drained fuel filters. And drained is devoid of free-flowing liquids. And then other regulatory exclusions, recycled oil, mercury, use or reuse on site. That's that 25143.2. Surplus material. And that's the question we had earlier. I'm going to get rid of it to my neighbor because they can use it. Okay, that'll work. Did you sell it? You gave it to him? Did you have to pay your neighbor to take it? Empty containers. Empty, different definitions of empty, different size, different constraints. Empty containers that are extremely or acutely hazardous waste, they have to be triple rinsed. That could be treatment. But empty containers, other than polys, if it's carboys, if it's a metal drum or a plastic drum and they're emptied, we have exceptions to the rules for handling those empty containers.
By triple rinse, the non-acutely hazardous container?
Not necessarily. Did the process of rinsing the container occur before or after it was empty? No, not treatment. If the process of rinsing the container was used to devoid the contents of the drum to make it empty, prior to being empty, it's subject to hazardous waste regulations treatment. If you could devoid the contents of the drum prior to rinsing, and it's not acutely or extremely hazardous waste, and then by rinsing the drum after it was emptied, not considered treatment because it's not subject to hazardous waste regulations.
They won't pick it up unless you...
Yeah. If they're empty before rinsing, not treatment. If you have to rinse them to empty them, treatment. Well, I'm assuming that the drum and a representative sample of the drum and the material inside the drum using SW846 would fail fish bioassay or whatever test I'm subjected to. I would venture to say more than half of industry drums emptied are not subject to hazardous waste regulations whatsoever. They're not hazardous waste. They may have had a hazardous material, but they don't meet the definition of a hazardous waste. They don't. There's a lot of materials. You even test the material. It doesn't kill the fish. It's not ignitable, not corrosive. Okay. If the process of rinsing the drum creates a waste, that waste may actually be subject to hazardous waste requirements. But that's different than actually being considered treatment. I may not be considered treatment, but I may be producing a waste that's subject to hazardous waste requirements. Yeah. But not all drums that are emptied are hazardous waste. A lot of them are. A lot of them aren't. Yeah. If the drum is a line drum and I can remove the liner, similar to rinsing, at that point, they'd probably take the drum. I wouldn't have to rinse it in the first place. Yeah. And a lot of industry, a lot of practices are very critical of drums being rinsed before they're being reclaimed and sent back. There was an incident that evolved here in Southern California 7 years ago where two individuals that worked at a inland facility took a Sawzall for a drum to make a barbecue. And they took a Sawzall to a 55-gallon black metal drum to make a barbecue. You heard about this, but they did it. Bzzz, boom. One dead, and then one was actually seriously injured. And so there was a criminal investigation that occurred, DTSC, sheriff, Los Angeles City, and they looked at what vendors provided drums for purposes of reclamation to their facility. And they went through and looked at them all. And if you ever look at the empty container provisions for regulatory exclusions that are actually in Title 22 for empty containers, if you have an empty container, it cannot contain a hazardous characteristic. When you empty a 55-gallon drum, what happens when you close it? Yeah, it's hazardous. It exhibits the characteristics of ignitability. If you were to ignite that through friction, yeah. So I caution you, empty containers, sounds pretty simple. Get the 8-page fact sheet and comb through it from DTSC. It is simple. But make certain it's empty and make certain you're excluded. Okay. The recycled on site. Recycled on site, there's that 25143. That is either in D or B. That's that excluded recyclable material. I take oil out of a compressor, put it in a drum. So I'm temporarily accumulating it prior to reuse. It's called recycling. So that's managing hazardous waste. Well, it's not. I'm going to use it. No, it is. I've used it. It's used. It's not spent because I don't have to process it to reuse it. It's used. And if you've used something and you temporarily accumulate prior to reuse, which is recycling, then I'm relinquishing it out of that unit for a temporary period of time. And if it's a hazardous waste, i.e. if it meets the characteristic of a hazardous waste, that's a hazardous waste that requires labeling. Well, but I'm going to use it. It's still material. I'm still going to use it. Oh, okay. You can do that. But you have to call that an excluded recyclable material. And you have to label it that. And if you don't, it says very specifically that it's a hazardous waste. Well, but I just mark it excluded recyclable material. It's off the radar. You have to put all the other components on that drum. Markings, labels, accumulation time frame. That all goes on the drum. But then when you go to reuse it, it just goes back into the unit. It's not a hazardous waste. It's an excluded on-site recyclable material, not off-site. If I ship it off-site, all bets are off. You ready? Any questions? You good? Okay, this is what I'm going to do. Here's my deal. There's no deal. If you have questions, feel free to come up. Ask me. I'll stick around till the cows come home. If you'd like, I can give you my card. You can call me tomorrow, or tomorrow after 10. Good luck to you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.